She had already survived 3 assassination attempts by the time she reached the harbor that October night. Her 13-year-old brother, Ptolemy the Third, wanted her dead, not exiled, not imprisoned, but eliminated permanently from the succession. His advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, had turned the boy into a weapon against his own sister, convincing him that shared rule was impossible, that only one sibling could sit on the throne of Egypt. Cleopatra had fled to Syria, raised an army of mercenaries, and marched back toward Alexandria. But she knew military force alone would not be enough. Rome had inserted itself into this civil war, and Julius Caesar now sat in her palace deciding which sibling deserved his support. The problem was simple and terrifying. Every entrance to that palace was guarded by men loyal to her brother, men with orders to kill her before she could speak a single word to the Roman general. The solution she devised was insane, humiliating, and brilliant in equal measure. She would enter her own palace not as a queen but as cargo, rolled into a merchant's carpet and carried past the guards who wanted her dead. But before we unravel what happened inside those palace walls that night, we need to understand what drove a queen to such desperate measures, and why the man waiting inside that room held the fate of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization in his hands. If you find yourself drawn into this story, consider subscribing to join us on more journeys through history's most pivotal moments. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, and in all those years, the family had perfected one particular art above all others, the art of murdering each other. This was not figurative language or historical exaggeration. The Ptolemies killed their siblings, their parents, their children, and their spouses with a regularity that shocked even the Romans, who were themselves no strangers to political violence. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy the Quiescent, had executed his eldest daughter, Berenice IV, after she seized the throne during his exile. This was the household in which Cleopatra grew up, the family dinner table where she learned that love meant nothing and power meant everything. She watched her father return from exile with Roman legions at his back, watched him execute his own daughter without hesitation, watched him drink himself to death while the kingdom crumbled around him. The lesson was clear. In the Ptolemaic court, sentiment was weakness, and weakness meant death. By the time she was 18 years old, she had already witnessed the deaths of 2 sisters, understood that her younger brother was being groomed as her replacement, and recognized that her survival depended entirely on her ability to outthink everyone around her. She had also recognized something else, something that would define her entire approach to power. The Ptolemies had survived for 3 centuries, not through military strength or popular support, but through their willingness to ally with whatever external power dominated the Mediterranean. First it was Macedon, then the Seleucid Empire, and now it was Rome. The pharaoh who understood Rome best would be the pharaoh who survived. The arrangement that placed her on the throne was itself a death sentence, wrapped in royal protocol. When Ptolemy Thwene died in 51 BC, his will specified that Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy III would rule jointly as co-regents, following the Egyptian tradition of sibling marriage that the Ptolemies had adopted to legitimize their dynasty. Cleopatra was 18. Her brother was 10 years old. On paper, this looked like a partnership, but everyone in Alexandria understood the reality. Whoever controlled the boy king controlled Egypt, and the advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII had no intention of sharing that control with his ambitious older sister. The eunuch Pothinus served as the young king's regent and chief minister. The general Achilles commanded the royal army. Together with the rhetorician Theodotus, these men formed a council that effectively ruled Egypt through the child pharaoh, and Cleopatra represented the single greatest threat to their power. The collision was inevitable, But what happened next would set the stage for one of history's greatest gambles, and it would all depend on a single night, a single room, and a rolled piece of fabric that would change everything. For the first 18 months of their joint reign, Cleopatra fought a bureaucratic war against her brother's advisors, inserting her name before his on official documents, issuing coins that featured only her portrait, and conducting diplomatic business without consulting the Regency Council. She was testing boundaries, establishing precedents, making clear that she considered herself the senior ruler despite her brother's theoretical equal status. The advisors responded by systematically undermining her authority, countermanding her orders, and spreading rumors about her unfitness to rule. The conflict escalated through 50 BC and into 49 BC, each side probing for weaknesses, each side preparing for the moment when Cold War would become hot. That moment came in the summer of 48 BC, when Pothinus and Achilles finally convinced Ptolemy Therineond to sign an order expelling his sister from Alexandria and stripping her of all royal titles. The expulsion was not a gentle exile to a comfortable villa somewhere in the countryside. It was a death warrant. Cleopatra understood immediately that if she remained within reach of her brother's forces, she would suffer the same fate as her sister Berenice: execution, probably public, certainly brutal. She fled east with a small retinue of loyal servants, crossed the Sinai Peninsula, and eventually reached Syria, where she began the seemingly impossible task of raising an army that could challenge her brother's control of Egypt. The resources available to her were minimal. She had some jewelry that could be sold, some loyal followers who believed in her cause, and her own formidable intelligence. But she had no treasury, no established military force, and no powerful allies willing to risk war with the Egyptian crown. While Cleopatra was gathering mercenaries in Syria, the Mediterranean world was being torn apart by a Roman civil war that would reshape everything she knew about power and politics. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies in the First Triumvirate, had become mortal enemies competing for control of the Roman Republic. Their conflict had divided the Roman world into two armed camps, and by the summer of 48 BC, the decisive battle was approaching. Egypt, with its vast grain reserves and strategic location, became a crucial prize that both Roman generals desperately wanted to control. Whoever held Egypt held the key to feeding Rome, and whoever fed Rome held the loyalty of its hungry masses. The young king's advisors made their choice, and it was a catastrophic miscalculation that would ultimately cost them everything, including their lives. Pompey arrived off the Egyptian coast in late September of 48 BC, seeking sanctuary after his devastating defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus. He had fought alongside Ptolemy Thyointh years earlier, helping the previous pharaoh reclaim his throne, and he expected that this old alliance would guarantee him refuge and support from the sun. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus saw the situation differently. They recognized that Pompey was now a hunted fugitive whose presence in Egypt would draw Caesar's wrath down upon the kingdom. The deliberations took place in the royal council chamber, while Pompey's ship waited offshore, and Theodotus reportedly delivered the decisive argument. If they sheltered Pompey, they would make an enemy of Caesar. If they turned Pompey away, they would make an enemy of Pompey. The only safe course was to eliminate Pompey entirely, thereby removing the problem and presenting Caesar with a gift that would place him in their debt. The murder was carried out with brutal efficiency on September 28, 48 BC. A small boat rowed out to Pompey's ship, carrying Achilles and two Roman officers who had once served under Pompey's command. They invited Pompey to come ashore and meet with the young king. Pompey's wife Cornelia watched from the deck as her husband climbed into the small boat, and she watched as the assassins drew their swords and stabbed him repeatedly before he could reach land. His body was dumped in the surf. His head was severed and preserved for presentation to Caesar. The advisors congratulated themselves on a masterstroke of political calculation. They did not realize that they had made one of the worst miscalculations in ancient political history. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria on October 248 BC, just 4 days after Pompey's murder. He came with a relatively small force, only 4,000 legionaries and 800 cavalry, because he had pursued Pompey so rapidly that the bulk of his army had not yet caught up. Instead of being cautious, Caesar entered Alexandria like a conqueror, preceded by his lictors bearing the fasces. The Alexandrians were outraged by this display of Roman arrogance in their own capital, and riots broke out in the streets. Several of Caesar's soldiers were killed by angry mobs. The situation was deteriorating rapidly when Theodotus arrived at Caesar's quarters with his carefully preserved gift, the severed head of Pompey the Great, presented in a basket like a prize melon from the market. According to Plutarch, Caesar turned away from the head and wept. Pompey had been his enemy at the end, yes, but he had also been a fellow Roman noble, someone who deserved a dignified end and proper funeral rites. The Egyptians had treated him like a common criminal, and now presented his rotting head as if they expected gratitude. Caesar was reportedly disgusted by the murder and furious at the presumption of the advisors who thought they could purchase his favor with such barbarism. He demanded that Pompey's remains be collected and cremated with proper Roman ceremonies. Then he summoned both Ptolemy Thavatrine and Cleopatra to appear before him so he could adjudicate their civil war. This summons was exactly the opportunity Cleopatra had been waiting for. But between her and the Roman general stood an army loyal to her brother, guards with orders to kill her on sight, and a palace she could not enter through any conventional means. She needed a plan that no one would anticipate. The message from Caesar reached Cleopatra at her military camp near Pelusium, on Egypt's eastern frontier. She understood immediately that this summons represented her best and possibly her only chance to save her throne and her life. A military victory against her brother's forces was far from certain, but a political victory, won through direct appeal to Caesar's authority, could achieve everything she wanted without the risks of battle. The problem was getting to Caesar. The overland route to Alexandria passed through territory controlled by Ptolemy's forces. The sea route was equally dangerous. The harbor was watched, incoming vessels were searched, and any ship carrying Cleopatra would be intercepted long before it reached the palace docks. The solution came from her understanding of how palace security actually functioned. The guards were looking for a queen, a woman traveling with attendants and insignia of royal rank. They were not looking for cargo. Every day, merchants delivered goods to the palace complex: food, wine, textiles, furniture. These deliveries were inspected, but the inspections focused on preventing weapons and assassins from entering. A carpet was not a weapon. A carpet did not look like an assassination attempt. The plan was degrading in a way that only Cleopatra fully understood. She would enter her own palace not as a sovereign, but as an object, not walking but carried, not commanding but concealed. The success of this plan depended entirely on finding someone trustworthy enough to carry it out. Cleopatra selected Apollodoros, a Sicilian merchant who had served her household for years and whose loyalty had been tested repeatedly during her exile. He was Greek-speaking, which meant he could pass easily among the cosmopolitan traders who frequented Alexandria's markets. He had legitimate business credentials that would explain his presence at the palace. He was strong enough to carry the carpet himself, and he understood that if they were caught, he would certainly be executed along with his queen. Apollodoros accepted the mission without hesitation. The preparations were made in secret, the timing calculated to the hour, and everything depended on reaching Caesar before the sun rose and the palace came fully awake. But the most dangerous moment would come when the carpet was finally unrolled. because Cleopatra had no guarantee that Caesar would be impressed rather than insulted. They left at dusk, when the light was failing and the harbor traffic was thinning, but the gates had not yet closed for the night. Apollodorus had obtained a small boat, something that looked like a fishing vessel, nothing that would attract attention from the harbor patrols. Cleopatra was already rolled inside the carpet. The interior was dark, hot, and suffocating. She could not see where they were going. She had to remain silent and still for the entire journey, trusting completely in Apollodorus and in the plan she had devised. The crossing from the eastern harbor to the palace docks took perhaps an hour. The carpet shifted and swayed with the movement of the boat. Every sound from outside, voices calling across the water, the splash of oars from passing vessels, the distant shouts of harbor guards, could have been the first sign of discovery. Cleopatra lay in complete darkness, unable to see, unable to move, barely able to breathe through the heavy fabric pressing against her face. She had to trust completely in Apollodorus, in the plan she had devised, in the hope that the guards would see cargo and not think to look for a queen. They reached the palace docks without incident. Apollodorus lifted the carpet onto his shoulders and began the long walk through the palace complex, past guards and servants, who saw only a merchant delivering a late shipment. The palace of the Ptolemies was enormous, and Caesar had been given quarters in the royal wing, which meant Apollodorus had to pass through multiple checkpoints. At each checkpoint, he presented himself as a merchant, delivering a gift for the Roman general. The guards searched Apollodorus for weapons, examined the carpet's exterior, and passed him through. None of them unrolled the bundle. The moment of reveal came in Caesar's private chambers, late in the evening of October the 48th BC. Apollodorus entered the room, set down his burden, and unrolled the carpet to reveal the Queen of Egypt lying on the floor at the Roman general's feet. Plutarch says that Caesar was captivated by her boldness and cleverness, that he admired the stratagem she had employed to reach him. She was 21 years old, educated in the Greek rhetorical tradition, fluent in Latin as well as Egyptian and several other languages. He was 52, the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world, a connoisseur of intelligence and audacity, who had built his career on exactly the kind of bold gamble Cleopatra had just executed. The conversation that followed lasted the entire night. We know this because Ptolemy III arrived at Caesar's quarters the next morning expecting a private audience and found his sister already there, clearly having spent hours in intimate discussion with the Roman general. The young king tore off his diadem, threw it on the ground, and ran out into the streets, screaming that he had been betrayed. In a single night, Cleopatra had accomplished what months of military preparation could not achieve. She had reached Caesar. She had made her case. She had transformed herself from a fugitive exile into a queen with Roman backing. What exactly did she say during those long hours? What arguments did she make? What promises did she offer? The ancient sources give us hints, and what they suggest reveals far more than a simple seduction. Cleopatra's pitch to Caesar was almost certainly strategic and political, rather than romantic. She understood what Rome wanted from Egypt: grain, money, stability. And she positioned herself as the ruler best equipped to deliver these things. Her brother's advisors were incompetent, she would have argued, pointing to the disastrous miscalculation of Pompey's murder. They were corrupt, enriching themselves while Egypt's finances deteriorated. She, by contrast, was educated, capable, and genuinely aligned with Roman goals for the region. She could be Rome's partner in Egypt in ways that her brother's Regency Council never would be. Caesar had every reason to find these arguments persuasive. He was trapped in Alexandria with insufficient troops, surrounded by a hostile population. Ptolemy's advisors had already demonstrated their untrustworthiness. Cleopatra, by contrast, had demonstrated remarkable courage and ingenuity just by reaching his quarters. She was also offering him legitimacy. If he adjudicated a succession dispute and found in favor of Cleopatra based on the merits of her case, he would be seen as an honest broker rather than a conqueror. The settlement that Caesar announced the following day revealed how thoroughly Cleopatra had won. He reaffirmed the joint rule that her father's will had specified, but she would be the senior partner because she was older, more capable, and now backed by Roman military power. Her brother would be a figurehead at best. The advisors who had controlled Ptolemy were specifically marginalized. Pothinus was eventually executed on Caesar's orders. Achilles was killed during the subsequent fighting, and Theodotus fled Egypt entirely. The Regency Council that had expelled Cleopatra and tried to have her killed was completely destroyed within a few months of that October night. But the Night of the Carpet had consequences far beyond Egypt's civil war. Consequences that would reshape Roman politics and ultimately contribute to the fall of the Roman Republic itself. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers during his time in Alexandria. By the time Caesar left Egypt in the summer of 47 BC, Cleopatra was pregnant with his child. She gave birth to a son in June of 47 BC and named him Ptolemy Caesar, though he was popularly called Caesarion from infancy. This child was the only son that Julius Caesar ever acknowledged, and his existence created enormous problems for Roman politics. Caesar had no legitimate male heir, and Roman law did not recognize children born to foreign mothers. Yet Caesar treated Cleopatra and their son with remarkable favor. He brought her to Rome in 46 BC and installed her in a villa across the Tiber. He placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix. The existence of Caesarion was certainly a factor in the political turmoil that followed Caesar's murder. Cleopatra fled Rome immediately after the assassination, returned to Egypt, and began preparing for the power struggle that she knew would determine whether her son lived or died. The carpet entrance became famous throughout the ancient world almost immediately. Roman writers used it as evidence of Cleopatra's deviousness, qualities they presented as dangerous and unfeminine. Modern interpretations recognize it as a masterpiece of asymmetric strategy, executed by someone who understood that she could not win through conventional means and therefore had to change the terms of the contest entirely. What made the stratagem work was not just its audacity, but its psychological insight. Cleopatra understood that Caesar was a man who valued courage and cleverness above beauty and charm. She understood that arriving through impossible means would impress him more than any conventional embassy. The carpet entrance worked because Cleopatra knew her audience. She had studied Caesar from afar, analyzed his character, and designed an approach specifically calculated to appeal to his particular values. But the woman who emerged from that carpet would need all her intelligence and courage for the challenges ahead. Challenges that would eventually destroy her, her children, and the 3,000-year civilization she fought to protect. The immediate aftermath was triumph. Cleopatra regained her throne, defeated her enemies, and bore a son to the most powerful man in the world. But the longer-term consequences were more complicated. Her alliance with Caesar made her a target for Roman political factions. Her presence in Rome scandalized conservative senators. The golden statue in Venus's temple was seen as blasphemy. These resentments contributed to the atmosphere of crisis that led to Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March, 44 BC. The years that followed required her to find new Roman patrons, which led her into the alliance with Mark Antony that would define the rest of her life. Their common enemy was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, who viewed both Antony and Cleopatra as threats to his own supremacy. The conflict escalated until it exploded into open war, culminating in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC and the invasion of Egypt the following year. Cleopatra died on August 12th, 30th BC, probably by her own hand, certainly to avoid the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. Her son Caesarion was captured and executed a few weeks later. Her 3 children by Antony were spared and raised in Rome. The kingdom itself ceased to exist as an independent nation and became a Roman province. The woman who had once rolled herself into a carpet to reach Julius Caesar ended her life as the last of an ancient dynasty, the final independent ruler of a civilization that had endured for 3 millennia. She had fought to preserve that civilization with every weapon available to her: intelligence, charm, strategic marriage, military alliance, even the willingness to debase herself as cargo to reach a potential savior. In the end, none of it was enough to overcome the power of Rome. But the image of her emerging from that carpet, young and brilliant and undefeated, despite everything her enemies had done to destroy her, has endured as a symbol of courage and audacity that transcends the tragedy of her ultimate defeat. The carpet entrance was not the most important event in Cleopatra's life. Her alliance with Caesar, her relationship with Antony, her final stand against Octavian, these were the moments that shaped the Mediterranean world. But the carpet entrance captures something essential about who she was. She was someone who refused to accept the constraints that others tried to impose on her. She was someone who understood that intelligence and creativity could overcome superior force. She was someone willing to risk everything on a single bold gamble, when bold gambling was the only option left. 2,000 years later, we remember that carpet more vividly than we remember most of the battles and treaties of the ancient world. We remember it because it speaks to something universal: the possibility that cleverness can defeat power, that the underdog can win, that the person with no good options can create new options through sheer force of will. Cleopatra did not save her kingdom in the end. She did not preserve her dynasty or protect all her children or prevent Rome from swallowing Egypt into its empire. But she survived longer than anyone expected, fought harder than anyone thought possible, and left behind a story that still inspires after 2 millennia. The Roman propagandists who came after her tried to reduce her to a seductress, a temptress who used her body to bewitch aging generals. But the carpet entrance tells a different story, a story of intelligence, courage, and desperation transformed into brilliant strategy. The woman who allowed herself to be rolled into that carpet and carried past her own guards was not relying on her beauty. She was relying on her understanding of power, her ability to read her audience, and her willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. She emerged from that carpet as a queen, and despite everything that came after, that is how she remains in our imagination, unbowed, unbroken, and absolutely unwilling to accept defeat.